To those people that always know exactly how you should raise your kids, this adorable video kinda puts them in their place.
That's what I'm saying, man. I don't know who's out there giving all these kids love and attention these days, but it needs to stop. We're raising a bunch of brats. Up on the menu today for brat number 2 is a Nutella strawberry roll-up with a twist. Make sure to cut your berries small. It makes a difference. And flatten out your bread. Cut the crust off and throw it away. You didn't like that, did you? You could also save it and make breadcrumbs, yada yada. Pop those babies onto a skillet and toast them on all sides or into an air fryer. I don't have one anymore. You don't have to do this, but I like to cut them into bite-sized pieces. And my kids like them cold, but they're fire warm. Next up is Squidward cheese stick. Told myself I'd never be that mom, wasting money on character crap, but my spoiled brat threw a whole fit when he saw these. They definitely weren't just on sale. Next, I'm doing something different. I've never seen anyone do this, but I'm doing it. It's bologna and Munster cheese, and I rolled it up and stuck it on a pretzel. And we're bringing back the Great Monster. One of my little eyes never made it home, so he only gets one. Finishing up with some celery and Ellie the elephant. And the last but certainly not least, a cookie. He gets only 3 pieces. You know you can't forget mom tax.
I don't mind spoiling kids. There's really not a reason not to. The problem comes when they become brats, pains, refusing to abide by any of society rules. And that's not coming from spoiling them. That's coming from allowing them to do that in the first place. Give your kids candy doesn't make them bad. Allowing them to run up and down the stairs at the library screaming at the top of their lungs, however, that's the problem. So, all these people complaining about spoiled kids these days, they're just complaining about children. The reality is, humans have been the same for the last few thousand years. No matter what you do, society will move forward. Just basically that. The media loves pointing out when it's the worst possible case scenario when Democrats are in charge. Remember how the media told Democrats they couldn't possibly get 100 million vaccinations in people's arms, and they doubled that number? Or how it would be impossible to get anyone out of Afghanistan, and the Biden administration got over 100,000. The greatest withdrawal ever of troops that lost a war. So Dr. Doom got his name because in the Bush administration, he kept telling us that the economy was going to collapse because of housing, because of credit default swaps. But no one in the media wanted to listen to him because it was during a Republican administration. Now, he's telling the Fed that they should go beyond what they currently are doing, destroy the job markets, because, like economists, he would rather have inflation under control than a full job market. Take a look at this video.
You have warned about stagflation, and some of the numbers we're seeing in slowdown might point in the direction of the stag part. What about the inflation part? Is it possible that the slowing down will actually avoid some of the inflation you're concerned about?
Well, inflation in the United States is still 8.5%. It might have peaked, but the question is how fast it's going to fall. With the Fed still having real rates on the policy side highly negative, I don't think the monetary policy is tight enough to push inflation towards 2% fast enough. So I'm still of the view that in the past, in the US, whenever you had inflation above 5% and unemployment below 5%, the Fed tightening has led to a hard landing. So my baseline is a hard landing.
So we got those CPI and PPI numbers out last week that the markets found encouraging. What did you take from them? Does that indicate we have peaked?
Yes, we may have peaked, even if there could be further spikes in inflation driven by China continuing with zero COVID policy. The war between Russia and Ukraine could get worse, and therefore you could have further spikes to commodity prices, whether energy, food, fertilizer, industrial metals. So there are plenty of upsides. And what goods inflation may be going down, service inflation, especially shelter and others, is still quite persistent. And wages are growing much higher than productivity productivity. Therefore, there is a wage price spiral, even if wages are growing less than prices. So we are still in a severely inflationary environment, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Dr. Ravina, you mentioned the negative real rate. In your opinion, what does the Federal Reserve have to do? How much hiking do they need to do to really put a stop to inflation?
Well, they already say in the dot plot that by the end of the year, they should be at 3.4, and then by 3.8 at the end of next year. So markets expecting a pivot and the Fed cutting rates next year, to me, sounds delusional. But even if you were at 3.8 with inflation still well above target, around 8%, falling only gradually, core inflation around 6-ish, you're still in negative territory. So the Fed funds rate should be going well above 4%, 4.5% to 5%, in my view, to really push inflation towards 2. If that doesn't happen, inflation expectations are going to get unhinged. Or if that happens, then we're going to have a hard landing. So either way, either you get a hard landing or you get inflation getting out of control.
To avoid that unhinging, as you put it, of inflation expectations, does the Fed need to get to 2, or what if it got to 3?
Well, they're going to get initially towards 3 and then to 2. But the point is that with headline being around 8.5 and with core being around 6-ish, even getting to 3 is going to be quite a challenge. And therefore, even getting to 3 implies effectively, in my view, a hard landing of the real economy. And the data suggests that we're headed towards that hard landing. You know, the Empire State measure today was terrible. The data out of China are terrible. The data out of Europe are terrible. The employment report was positive, but all the forward-looking indicators of the labor market, initial claims, job openings, quits, the ISM component that is employment, announcement of layoffs, and so on and so on. All those are suggesting that there's a very sharp deceleration even of the labor market. Payroll numbers are a backward-looking indicator, not a forward-looking indicator. So we are in a sharp slowdown. We had 2 negative quarters of growth in the first half. We're going towards a recession.
So you've talked about recession before, and even on Bloomberg, you said that it's delusional, to use that word again, to think that it's going to be relatively short and relatively shallow. Is that still your view?
Yes, it is my view, because we live in a world in which there is massive amounts of private and public debt. So if you go into a recession, zombie corporation, zombie financial institution, zombie household, zombie countries, the governments are going to go bust. Everybody's tightening at the same time. In the last 2 crises, GFC and COVID, we eased massively monetary and fiscal policy because it was a demand shock and we had deflationary pressure. This time around, we're going to be having to tighten monetary policy into a recession because inflation is above target. We don't have fiscal bullets, and with negative supply shocks, fiscal stimulus is the wrong policy response. So if you combine all these things together, not only we get stagflation with negative supply shock, we get a stagflationary debt crisis. So the recession is going to be long, protracted, severe, and associated with financial distress across the board.
We never like to say it's different this time, but is it slightly different this time in the sense that there is a lot of money still on the balance sheets of households and corporations? There's a lot of dry powder out there left over from a lot of that fiscal stimulus.
Well, both the corporate sector and the household sector are split. If you're in the top part of the distribution of the household sector, you have income, you have wealth, you have jobs. But, you know, in the bottom side, things are very stressed out, both in terms of P&L and the balance sheet. Same thing in the corporate sector. There were tons of firms that have highly leveraged, didn't have much profits, they were zombie, they would have gone bust. But during COVID, we bailed out everybody. 0 rate, negative rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, backstopping, money market, commercial paper, high yield, high grade, you name it. Now that we have to tighten as inflation is higher, the zombies are going to collapse. And both in the household sector, in the corporate sector, in the shadow financial system, some sovereigns and some countries, you have many, many parts of the global economy that are essentially zombie, and they're going to go bust. So the average essentially hides the fact that in terms of distribution, you have really stronger balance sheets and worse balance sheets, and the worst balance sheets are now dominant.
So to try to look for a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, is there possibly some encouragement from the elimination of some of the so-called zombie companies? In this sense, zombie companies typically occupy a fair amount of capital that's not as productive as it could be. Could the redeployment of capital actually increase productivity and help us, maybe not in the short term, but in the medium and longer term?
Yes, in the medium long term, you have to get rid of the zombies because you need creative destruction. But that process is associated with a recession, with financial crisis, with massive defaults across the board. We saw some of that happening during the global financial crisis. The problem is that every time you try to do creative destruction, central banks come with an excuse to try to backstop household corporates, financial system, governments, and so on. And that creates a cycle of a debt trap where you're using unconventional monetary, fiscal, and credit policy to backstop the system. You prevent essentially that creative destruction occurring, and you have increasing zombification of the economy. Private and public debt ratio globally used to be in 2000, 200% of GDP. Today, they're 350% and rising. In advanced economies, are 420% and rising. In China, 330% of GDP and rising. In the US, private and public debt as a share of GDP is higher than during the Great Depression and after World War II. And we're not coming out of a major war or a Great Depression. So these debt levels are unsustainable across the world. And that's official debt. If you include implicit liability coming from aging, unfunded Social Security, healthcare, and so on, the number is even more staggering in terms of debt ratio and unsustainable debt conditions.
Okay, let's talk about the wage price spiral. What he's saying is, now that wages are going up faster than inflation, the first time in 50 years, we have a wage price spiral. It doesn't actually matter if it's affecting inflation because it's just corporate price gouging. But what the real problem is people getting their fair share. That's what he's concerned about. The Fed has never been able to control the economy like they thought they could, like they tell the media and the media blatantly reports it. Every time the Fed tries to cool off the economy, they run the economy into the ground within a recession. The Fed even said that they would be perfectly happy to sacrifice your job to keep inflation under control. The fact is the Fed can't do it, but this guy thinks the Fed should do more to risk your job and the economy in a whole to stop inflation. There is a fundamental problem with the economy, and it's that the rich get richer while the poor and middle class get squeezed more and more. Dr. Doom is trying to put us right back where we were, where corporations have all the power and the people don't. Because the Fed has one tool at its disposal, and that's hiking interest rates or cutting them. They have two jobs. One, to control inflation. Two, to ensure a full job market. Now, Dr. Doom is very clear that he doesn't believe that we can have both. So, like most economists that got us into this mess, he believes that we should destroy the job market so that corporations don't have any problems whatsoever. But if you want a strong economy, how about we cut taxes on the first $50,000 people make until zero? No Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid. All that comes out after the first $50,000. A minimum of 40% tax on profits over $1 billion. Massive investments in schools and infrastructure. That would build an economy. But he wants to get us back to where we were. They're stuck on interest rates because that's all the Fed can do. And they're unwilling to look at the major issues in our society and actually do anything about them. The same people that got us into this mess now gets to go on TV, night in, night out, to convince us that the recession is coming, and it's going to be devastating. And you should be happy that the Fed's doing this, because they never tell us that point, do they, though? But they already said that they would gladly do away with our jobs. We need reform. And the corporate media definitely needs to revisit the reality that they're trying to gaslight us into believing. Republicans have always screamed about the deficit and we need to cut taxes. Those are two separate things. But the reality is they're combined to the same thing. They don't want the Democrats to spend any money whatsoever, because if they spent money on social programs, the population of the United States would like it, and they would like it to continue. And that prevents tax cuts for the ultra wealthy, because that is their entire party platform. Cut taxes on the rich so they give money to them to run for re-election. They also spend a lot on the military, again, to funnel money into the pockets of the rich. But the new bill, Republicans are putting forward conspiracy theories about the bill. $80 billion in new funding to the IRS. And what they're doing is risking the lives of IRS agents. And frankly, every single member of any state or federal government, their claims are that low and middle income earners will now get many more audits. They're also hiring 87,000 new IRS agents and giving them guns. For what reason? We don't really understand, other than, the IRS are going to come and take your money at gunpoint. This delusion that they're spreading is a massive danger, like all the other conspiracy theories. Because when people think there's someone out to get them, they're much more likely to commit violence. Now, where this $80 billion is actually going to is to revamp the IRS computer systems and update them and improve customer service, because wouldn't you actually like a IRS that's responsive when you tell them they made a mistake? Yeah. Every $1 that our federal government spends on the IRS trying to get money, they get $6 back, because billionaires and the rich and the corporations don't pay their fair share. $160 billion every year is estimated of what they don't pay. When we actually enforce audits on them, they're much more likely to pay. But again, Republicans want tax cuts. It's not the rule of law. It's the rule of the rich. You should not take anything from them, because they need to take it from you. Yes, that's who the Republicans are. Just a shield for the rich. It's really sad and pathetic, but that's where it all boils down to. The reason why they're making stuff up about this bill is because there's nothing in the bill that people would disagree with. 90% of people think we should raise taxes on the rich. And if you tell them, should the rich actually pay what they are supposed to be in taxes already, instead of using accountants to hide money from the IRS, I guarantee that 90% jump right up to near 100. But we don't get to have that actual discussion. We have to discuss the Republicans' crazy delusions on national media, because that is the only way they can push this country further to the right. Another failed Republican project to prove to their cult that they didn't actually lose the election, because honestly, this is what it boils down to. Republicans need to convince themselves that they got more votes, because there is a thing about fairness that is innate in every single person. So Republicans have to believe the delusional conspiracy theories in the first place before they're willing to throw in for an autocrat. Is everybody wants to be ruled by Trump. It's just those damn Democrats keep cheating us. That's the problem. No one actually wants democracy. So overthrowing America, is fair and just. Greg Phillips and Catherine Eldridge was part of this effort. They were the stars in the 2000 Mules movie, the one that said that they would absolutely definitely get evidence that Democrats varied enough ballots to overturn the elections. Now, they're now claiming that Chinese hacked into their system with no evidence and deleted the evidence that they gathered. That evidence would have actually proved it, but those Chinese are sneaky and they got in somehow, ignoring the blatant racism of the Republicans that blindly follow this stuff. They even went further in saying the upload is junk. It is trash. They didn't do a good job. Once you get into that video, it's nonsense. Complete nonsense. But it doesn't really matter, because Republicans are not going to look at it, not going to think about it, and not going to do anything. For 30 years, Republicans have been complaining about election fraud. Well, if you go back even further, it goes all the way back to Jim Crow laws. Because if you don't look like them, your vote is suspect. And to keep the election fair, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. Now, they've been hyping this all the way up to the conference, the pit. And how Democrats stole the election went up in smoke. Just before, Phillips said, "The part that was left out of the movie we have available. The media," he added, "was afraid of the summit because they have no idea how devastating some of these stories actually are." Catherine put in, "It's time to move on. Not to move on to what happened in 2020, because we still have to understand what happened. That is critical. We have to understand that, but we are 88 days out from the midterm. They have nothing, but they want to pretend like now that they're the heroes, because they just want to move on because they failed in this attempt to prove Democrats committed crimes." Another failed project. But the question is, should we move on to the prosecution phase? Putting both of these people in jail for fraud. Because clearly they lied over and over again. How much money did they siphon off from the Republicans? Can't really feel bad about them being ripped off, because they're really happy to hand over that money to every single con artist. But if we put all of them in jail, maybe someday Republicans will come back to reality and start caring about the United States once again. A new report from the New York Times says Trump threatened Garland before his announcement on making the search warrant public. Yes, Trump sent to Garland, through an intermediary that had access to the Justice Department, that he wanted Garland to know that the country is on fire. And what could Trump do to reduce the heat? Trump didn't want to reduce the heat. Trump was threatening the Attorney General, the weak Attorney General, that after Trump signed a statement saying there was no more classified information, lied on the statement, which should be enough to get most people put in prison. But it doesn't, because Garland is bending over backwards for Republicans. If you remember, it was reported that Garland said very seriously and kind of kiddish delusion that he doesn't want to prosecute those that attack the United States Capitol too harshly because it might radicalize them. Just chew on that for him. Garland doesn't want to stop those that attack the United States Capitol and try to overthrow America, because then they might get radicalized. How'd it work? Well, we just had another Republican attack an FBI office and try to kill FBI agents because Trump said so. Maybe if they were all prosecuted for the death of the cops and the rioters because they committed a felony and deaths occurred, tack all those deaths on, maybe then Republicans will get the point that they're not allowed to break the law. So what does Trump do after all this? Does he go on to lower the anger in the nation? Start to tell the truth? Because he asks Garland what he can do? No. Twitler goes on to truth this: there is no way to justify the unannounced raid of Mar-a-Lago, the home of the 45th President of the United States, who got more votes by far than any sitting president in the history of our country, by a very large number of gun-toting FBI agents and the Department of Justice. But in the interest of transparency, I call for the immediate release and complete unredacted affidavit pertaining to this horrible and shocking break-in. Also, the judge on this case should recuse. Why does he want the affidavit? Very specifically, he wants to know who in his circle is not being completely loyal to him. It's not that he actually cares, because the Republicans are not going to believe anything that the Justice Department puts out. Trump will lie once again, put FBI and cops and our elected officials once again in the crosshairs of his rabid mob. But he will be able to find out who is providing evidence on him and help shut down the investigation of him. Even though Garland is weak and refusing to do his job, we should also take note that Trump is actually scared. He's running like a coward, trying desperately to avoid conviction in one of his half a dozen criminal investigations into him. And that might be all that we ever get. There has been a lot of interesting discoveries in science lately. One of them is the Jacopil Keneru Kura. These were around in the Cretaceous period, which was 145 million years ago to 65 million years ago, and weighed about 9 to 15 pounds, the size of a house cat. Take a look at these guys. Wouldn't you like to have one of these as your pet? They were part of the Theroporan dinosaur group, also shield bearers. Stegosaurus, Ankylosaurus. They have bony ridges around their necks and backs. They also shows that the early ones had a much broader geographical range than what was previously thought. These are the first of its kind discovery of an armored dinosaur from the Cretaceous period in South America. They are the earliest known and most primitive of that group. They lived 200 to 100 million years ago as a group, and these Jacopil are the last ones to die out that we know of. Alright, now if you like those videos, help me make more. Like, subscribe down below, or you can go to my Patreon page and help support us. Or if you really want to help stop global warming, Down below, there's a power pipe that could end global warming in the next decade.